Migrating to Australia. It's the end of our last holidays for God knows how long. I'm Grant Williams. I'm sitting here in lovely Melbourne, and it's important to note that we're in Melbourne today because the guest, is very, very Melbourne. Joined as always, I have David Bongiorno here with me. Hello, David.
Afternoon, Grant. Did you have a nice break? Did you have any time off?
Oh, you know me, David. I regulate my life so that every day's time off, mate. So now before we get to our guest, are you now an immigration lawyer and not a migration agent?
Great question. Up until March 22, I had to be both a migration agent and an immigration lawyer. I've been an immigration lawyer since, 2018, October 2006. That was the date I left criminal law. And under law changes on March 22, to dispense migration advice, to give migration advice, being an immigration lawyer is more than enough. So there's no more double regulation for me and other immigration lawyers. We don't have to be migration agents anymore. So today, talking to you and Alan, I'm immigration lawyer, not a migration agent.
Okay. Now, this is an exciting episode for both David and I because our guest came to our notice, or certainly came to my notice, when I glimpsed a news item at the height of the lockdown, when Melbourne endured one of the longest lockdown periods in the world. And David and I were ensconced in our homes, and we were ordering in our goods from the supermarket and whatnot. And even though life was difficult, we felt that we certainly knew it was a very different way to live your life, locked down in your own home. It was nothing compared to the plight that the international students who had been in Australia, in Melbourne for a period of time, maybe they were in their first year, maybe they were in their second year, maybe they were completing PhDs or something and had been here 5, 6, even more years. Now, the government in Australia basically said to the international students, go home. They said that to everyone. Go home while the pandemic's on, go home. And there was no real thought put into a response by the federal government, and certainly the state governments were late to the party, and local governments didn't really have the infrastructure set up to help those people who were stranded here. Now, I was watching the news and I saw an item about a fella who ran a restaurant who was feeding international students. And the news piece that I saw had all these students lined up down the street, and the reporter was saying this restaurateur was using his own resources and feeding this amazing line of international students day after day. Well, I tracked him down. Alan Chong, thanks for joining us on Migrating to Australia. How are you?
It's a real pleasure, Grant and David. So thank you very much for letting me be part of this podcast.
Well, Alan, sorry, David, I just want to blow Alan's trumpet just a little bit more before we go into it. We get the word hero thrown at us so often, and people are lauded for doing things that are a tax break or just doing their normal job. Now, you helped countless people and used your own resources. To me, that's a hero. What do you reckon, David?
I think in 14 years of immigration law, it's probably the most heartwarming story I've ever come across. I've been practicing in immigration law, Alan, since 2006. The most beautiful gesture, the most genuine, warm, and simple and effective. So effective. Feeding the masses. What prompted you?
It's an interesting question, actually. When you said what prompts me, it's being a migrant myself and coming to Australia sharing Australian values such as equality, giving that underdog a chance, just mateship as well. Mateship's a term that was coined around Parliament for a while, and it's just myself living and breathing that Australian value that we all share. I think one thing with a lot of these students as well is they're not just students, a lot of them are aspiring Australians. I think that's a really important term to keep note of, because many people come to Australia aspiring to be Australians. What I guess sort of spurred me on was these are the values that I've bestowed ever since migrating to Australia. We got to help out a mate, and the funny thing is, the irony is, we address total strangers sometimes as mates. So that's just living and breathing those values in Australia.
Alan, can I ask you, before we talk specifically about feeding the students and your restaurant, you just mentioned that you're a migrant yourself. How did your journey to Australia begin?
We came through to Australia in the 80s. It was a business migration visa. And my parents wanted my sister and myself to have a better future, and Australia always presented that to us. We migrated from a very small country called Brunei, an interesting country. It's a controversial country at times, but it's from Australia. It's quite a homogenous country as well, whereas Australia is beautifully multicultural and quite tolerant as well.
Alan,
so yeah,
Brunei.
Since the 80s.
Alan, Brunei is a country that severely limits the amount of visitors that can come into Australia, into Brunei. I think that's true, isn't it? And it's a sultanate. It's
It's
governed.
correct, yes.
Yeah. So it's a monarchy, an Islamic monarchy. Is it quite normal? Is it usual for people to want to leave Brunei? Because I think it's one of the per capita, one of the richest countries in the world.
It certainly is. It's a very well-to-do country. It's tax-free in many senses. There's a massive welfare system there, but I think we're living in a global society. My parents certainly enjoyed their travels in their youth, and they still do. And when they encountered Australia, it presented such a beautiful option to consider. And that's what compelled them as well to start that migration journey in the 80s. And myself, I'm a product of that as well, going through an amazing education system back then. Also meeting fellow migrants, also assimilating and integrating in Australian society. It's been a great journey. It's been an interesting journey. It's different, but it is uniquely Australian, and that's a beautiful thing.
Alan, you talk with great love, admiration, respect for this country. Did coming from Brunei, where you never, correct me if I'm wrong, where one is never a citizen, did coming to Australia and becoming a citizen give you a greater sense and greater appreciation of this country than somebody who might only be a permanent resident? Because you're never citizens in Brunei, are you?
In Brunei, I was a citizen in Brunei, but it's a rarity for
yes.
non-Malays to be a citizen. It's a rarity. I'm a third generation Bruneian, and I became a citizen as a result of that. So it's not it's not like Australia. It's not like Australia where we've got a very different baseline. We've got a baseline which is a lot more welcoming and allows people to become citizens. It's in Brunei, it's almost a ethnic right to be a citizen, whereas Australia is values driven right that you can attain. So yeah, you jump through a few hurdles and everything, but it's nothing as complicated as some other countries.
Alan, you mentioned that it was sort of an ethnic segregation, the population and the rights that you can hold in Brunei. What is roughly the ethnic mix, and is inbound migration to Brunei a common thing?
Inward migration to Brunei it's common, but it's under very different pretenses, I believe. People tend to go to Brunei purely for work. Usually there to support. It's a very small country. It's only 400,000 people. So, it's got a hydrocarbon-based industry there, and it needs to attract some skilled and foreign labor sometimes because its own domestic population just can't sustain the technical demands and the labor demands in some of their industry. So it's different. Whereas I feel coming to Australia, I think the key word's always been opportunity. It's coming to a land of amazing opportunity because in many ways there's this strong sense of equality here. Yeah, sometimes there's a lot of people who muck it up and give Australia a bit of a bad name, but as a whole, this society is fairly equal. It holds equality as one of its keystone values. So it is interesting, to see sometimes from government to government they deviate, I think, from those keystone morals and values. But the community is different. The community tends to carry on with a bit more continuity and memory than governments do.
David, I think to put the size of Brunei into context, I think if you added my local government council area and your local government council area together, that would probably encompass about the population of Brunei. So that
pretty much
that gives you an idea that it's probably about 1/6 of the size of population-wise of Greater Metropolitan Melbourne, and well, it's only a speck of dust really if you compared it to the population size of Europe and the US. So it's a micro state really, and it exists, as you mentioned, Alan, on hydrocarbons. It's because there is a great reservoir of oil in the offshore waters that controlled by the Sultan of Brunei.
Correct.
You mentioned, Alan, that the Brunei, you had an excellent education. Is it a British-based or local-based education? What system do they run in Brunei?
Brunei, I think it's been blessed with its wealth, but it's an education system which is either very sort of public driven or private driven. A lot of its foundation is stemmed from influences from Britain because it was a British protectorate. It's a member of the Commonwealth still, so it does inherit a lot of those education structures from the UK. So people doing their O levels, for example, in Brunei.
And you came out. How old were you when you came out? You're a young man. You would have been primary school or just starting secondary school.
I first stepped into Australia when I was 7, but I've been in and out since then.
Ah,
So
in
yeah,
and out,
it
in and out.
was it was yeah, it was an interesting journey living in Australia because it was in Australia one moment and then out again for another moment and then in again. So it
What
was a little bit nomadic for a little bit. So yeah.
what drove that, Alan? Was that because your parents were maintaining businesses or a business in Brunei, or was there
Yeah,
some reason that they had to jump in and out of Australia?
a lot of it was work driven, uh, and it was just I think there were some challenges as migrants in the 80s as well because um, the 80s was a very very different time compared to now, and as a migrant, if you had the capacity, you would tend to sort of go visit back home, in inverted commas, back home, because you've got extended family there, you've got obligations with that extended family as well. So I know certainly with our family, it was very much like that.
Where are they spread? Are they spread in Malaysia as well as Brunei or anywhere else?
Well, COVID's been interesting. So mum's in Perth, dad's stuck in Brunei, and myself in Melbourne.
Alan, we like to have a look at the whole timeline of the journey, and we like to confront the sometimes challenging side of Australian society, as well as the amazing bits that we've already touched on. As a little tacker, coming into Australia at 7, uh, did you do much primary school and early secondary school here, or were you mostly schooled overseas?
I did half of my primary school in Australia and the other half overseas,
Okay, so
which was quite interesting because in primary school is really your formative years. That's where you'll grasp pronunciation, accents, and stuff like that. And it was interesting. It was interesting as a kid. Yeah.
well, my primary school years were mainly in the 70s. Um, uh, I think early 70s, mid 70s, and then off into secondary school. I think David's were pretty
Mid
similar.
70s, mid 70s, late 70s. That's right.
Yeah. Now, Alan, how did you find the experience as an obviously Asian looking kid at
Yeah.
school? Was it as rough as it would have been had you been at my primary school?
There's certainly moments where it was a bit tough. Without doubt, there certainly was. I mean, my surname's Chong. That's just asking for in the 80s. That's just asking for trouble. But I look, I look back to it, and I guess sometimes we come from a generation which is a little bit um, less sensitive to some sort of insults and such. We came into this country, excuse me. I think conditioned to be a bit more tolerant and in terms of what sort of encounters that we might come about, some negative encounters. I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, and my mum came back home. She was upset because uh, she was racially taunted when she went grocery shopping.
Mm.
And we were just little kids back then, but we felt that pain. Um, and it's things that we will remember, but on on the greater whole, and I think that's what as migrants we've always been instilled with. On a greater whole, the experience has been a wonderful experience. We I remember as a little kid, my mum was really interested in the church community. She got a bit more active with that. The church community was a very multicultural community too. But, I mean, multicultural in the sense that there was some multicultural elements to it, but it was still predominantly Caucasian. they shared really good values, and we were taken on and this country. Yeah, there's a lot of idiots as well, but as a whole, it's still a very, very kind and thoughtful country.
Alan, as a kid, explaining to
Lunch
your
was
peers in the
interesting. School
playground,
lunches were interesting. So yeah,
explaining to kids
yeah,
in the
bringing rice
playground
and
in the park.
noodles for lunch was interesting. So yeah.
Sorry, we lost each other. Are you there?
Yeah, no, David, can
Yeah, I'm
ask
here.
your question again, David?
I know I'm of Italian background on the paternal side, so people always, wondered about the background. Coming from Brunei, was it hard as a 7, 8-year-old to explain to little kids with no concept of geography where Brunei actually was? I mean, had people in the playground heard of Brunei? Because a lot of Australians can be blissfully ignorant, for want of a better term.
Yeah, that's a really good question because Brunei, even some adults at this point in time as well, like some people think Brunei is a country somewhere in the Middle East.
Mm.
But I guess that's just the thing. It's a small country. It's something I completely forgive. It's a country which doesn't exert much influence in the global arena, but it exists. It still exists. But it's not like a top 10 holiday destination. It's not anything along those lines. So it's completely forgivable that people might be ignorant of Brunei's existence.
People who do know about it fly the wonderful national carrier, and it's a great airline,
Yes, certainly is.
And what I've always wondered is, you mentioned that there's no potential for tourism on the count of size. What Bruneians I've encountered over the years are usually trilingual or quadlingual. How many languages do you speak?
Yeah, it's very common to utilize about 3, 4 languages in one sentence. It's an interesting culture there. It's we've got a lot of ethnic Malays. Nearly everyone speaks English. Um, courtesy of the British legacy there. Um, and the ones who are ethnically Chinese will speak Chinese as well. So it's usually three languages plus in a sentence.
And usually Aussies, we're monolingual. I mean, I have a few languages on account of my background, but do you have children?
No, I have a dog. That's about it.
Don't teach your dog anything apart from good tricks. No, I think
Yeah.
it's important. I mean, where we're located geographically, I think it's important that we have a greater appreciation of languages. And I wish Australia taught Chinese and Spanish to every kid in every school, because I think we miss out tremendously not speaking Chinese, Mandarin, as opposed to Cantonese. Cantonese maybe is a third language, but I took Latin when I had Latin or Chinese, and I still think, what a decision to make. Your Chinese, how is it these days?
My Chinese these days is I'd call it yum cha survival level. I'll get by ordering comfortably at yum cha, but outside of that, it gets a bit tricky.
I'll dazzle you with my foreign language skills. Upper Kabar Saldara.
Hey, not bad. A bit of Bahasa there.
I try and get as much of it into my head as I can, Alan. We had a phase in Australia where Indonesian was the fad language. I learnt it in. I didn't learn any language in primary school, but in first few handful of years at secondary school, Indonesian was there. But it's really gone out of fashion, which I find really hard to understand.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you guys bring up language as a school topic, and I would, I mean, if I was a member of government, I would be completely encouraging of Australians in a mainstream sense adopting skills and be encouraged to learn another language, because
100%.
this is a global society going forward, without doubt. There's so many things making this world a much smaller place. I think learning another language isn't it's not a sign of submission or
it's a bridge builder.
It's a bridge builder. Damn right. It's an absolute bridge builder. For myself, I've learned, like English, for example, coming through. It was a bridge builder. It wasn't a sign of submission. It was really a willingness to engage and be proficient in that engagement as well. For example, without doubt, whether we love it or not, China is a massive influence in the global arena now. But wouldn't it be so much better if we could converse and interact in those geopolitics on terms where they'll look at us and go, okay, we'll give you a bit of respect as well, because you're speaking our language literally,
We had a prime minister who could do that.
Oh, exactly right.
And do it very well as well.
Yeah.
I'll just throw in a red herring. I saw a story today, Alan, that Japan is now the biggest holder of American debt, not China. So
not China.
I think there might be a push on in several English-speaking countries to start brushing up on their Japanese again, because I think the samurai sword in the region might be rattling again, not in a warlike sense, but exerting its influence again over all of us. Now, Alan, you mentioned mateship in your comments about being Australian. I always contend, and I always push back and say this. I think every country has mateship. They just call it different things and they express it a different way. Now, I can't talk about an experience as a migrant. Never been one, but you're a citizen of the world. Is mateship uniquely Australian?
No, it's not uniquely Australian, but I believe it's a value which is really high up on the echelon of Australian values. For example, I go travel and I see really interesting countries which are also multicultural, but that mateship is not really that high on the echelon. For example, like I've been to the US, for example. You go to New York and stuff. I think that casualness to strike up a quick and easy conversation really isn't there. People are not laid back. People are really uptight. So it's really different. Whereas I reckon, it was really nice. I was just having a walk through the botanical gardens, and people, it's a nice day. If someone says, oh, it's a really nice day, someone else around there that will chime in that conversation and strike up conversation. And it's a really great vibe. And I think it's because we literally greet strangers with a g'day mate, whereas I think in some societies, let's say New York, for example, you don't really say that. You say, people tend to be a little bit more rough there. So
that's get out of my way, buddy. Get out of my way.
Yeah. So
Alan, you mentioned the bridge building through language. As a chef, food is another language through which you build bridges. And where did you train as a chef? Here or overseas or?
Oh, a little bit here, a little bit there, to be honest. I think, the food that we do is predominantly sort of Singaporean, Cantonese influence. So, it was always a little bit of time overseas where you hone in on your craft. But ironically, if I can share a little bit of story behind it as well, before before becoming, being in the hospitality industry, I worked in a global bank. I worked in HSBC for nearly 11 years.
So you made mum and dad very proud as a
And
banker.
that was a very interesting experience because it was, they still won't ask me any questions about their home loan, but yeah, because they seem to forget that I spent that long there. But no, it was an interesting place to work because it was in complete essence, it's a British bank with Asian roots, So yeah.
So, Alan, how did the restaurant come about? Tell us about the restaurant and tell us how you got into being a chef.
Oh, before you do that, can I ask you one question, Alan? What did you say to mum and dad when you changed career?
Yeah.
Were they tiger parents disappointed, or were they proud, or
They were actually pretty okay because my foray into it was somewhat on the safer side. I went into franchises first, so I had a couple of, I got made redundant after just over 10 years with the HSBC and got a nice little handshake from it. And I used some of that redundancy money to buy a little franchise, get that up and running.
What industry was that in, Alan, if you don't mind me asking?
It was still food and beverage. So
Okay.
yeah, that was about 10 years ago. So sort of dabbled in there because I really didn't want to go to another bank. I wanted to, and Australia's a great place. You have that freedom. You can give a go in a whole lot of other industries. I don't think that stigma is as prevalent as how it's stereotypically portrayed sometimes in Asian society. You get these tiger parents who want you to either be a accountant or a doctor or a lawyer. But for myself, it was more so, telling my parents as well, if I'm happy, I will prosper. So that was a key message. And, I think I guess it's a little bit more of a Western value sometimes, and I think that was an absolute blessing growing up in Australia. So yeah.
So from franchising in food and beverage, so that's for someone trying to think what that would be. That would be like a bubble cup store, or
exactly.
Whatever, Mr. Noodle Box or
exactly
whatever.
Right. Yeah, you cut your teeth doing that because with a franchise there's a few safety nets there, and then Tian in Flinders Lane here, and another project back in Singapore. These were my first forays into brand creation, so starting from scratch. Okay. So yeah.
My favourite franchise was Old Chinky Curry Puffs. Did you ever get involved with them?
No, but I visited I think there's one franchise in Perth, I think.
Wow.
So it didn't really blow up, but had my curry puff fix when I was visiting Perth.
The best curry puffs in the world from Old Chinky.
Good
Singapore's
stuff.
The best thing about Singapore in many ways. I love it. It's beautiful.
Absolute food heaven. Absolute food heaven.
Is that why you've made your restaurant Singapore focused, because it is food heaven? Absolutely.
Very much so. But I've put in some really interesting menu items as well, because how I approached this restaurant was, first and foremost, it's an Australian restaurant, but it's heavily influenced by Singaporean cuisine. It's an Australian restaurant because by default, it's in Australia, And Australia is a multicultural society. And that's how I'll always perceive this restaurant. Other people might have their own perceptions, but if you hear it, straight from my mouth anyway, it's an Australian restaurant with Singaporean influences. I do a Singapore chili crab jaffle, if you're interested.
Jaffle.
So, yeah.
Oh my God.
So there.
Brilliant. You open for breakfast? Grant and I'll pop in.
I'll open from 11 onwards, so yeah.
Brunch. Jeez.
Yeah,
Oh, you've got me
brunch.
hungry now.
Yeah.
Um, Alan, we did tease in our social media and whatnot that you had done the unthinkable. I think is that you'd really used your resources to help lots and lots of other people during COVID. So, can you give us an idea of how COVID at the time? Give us an idea of the time frame. I think it was about April or May that I became aware of what you were doing. Tell me if I've got it right, and tell me how the lockdown affected you and your business sort of immediately, and then what did you have to actually do to start feeding the international students?
So this was lockdown 2. This was our second lockdown, which was June,
It
if
was
I'm not
June. Okay,
mistaken.
so it was the
June.
height of winter.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
First lockdown, the tone was really different, I think. I think with first lockdown, there was a lot of fear because we didn't know what COVID presented, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel because we were.
Actually, Alan, can I interrupt you there too, just
Yeah.
so people who are overseas or in other parts of Australia understand? Now, you talk about 2 lockdowns, and so that tells me that you live in the east of Melbourne or in the city,
City.
because where I live, the lockdown started, and apart from I think it was 1 week where we were restricted not to the house, we were restricted to 5 kilometres. The lockdown didn't end on my side of town, so for people to understand, I just think of lockdown as this extremely long period. David, I think you were in the different situation where you had a short burst of freedom, and then our COVID numbers went crazy again.
Correct.
So that's just to place it in context, because I keep forgetting and I keep talking about the lockdown because that was my personal experience. So sorry, Alan, for interrupting. So we're in the depth of
not at
winter in
all.
June, and what was different about that second period from the one that started in sort of March?
So if you recall the announcement of that second lockdown, it was initially 6 weeks. And at that time, I thought to myself, okay, let's just provision for 6 weeks. I'll give it a go first. So the first week we did charity meals. I had no idea how well it would have been received because, as we all know, during lockdown, we live in these little bubbles where being able to see and interact with others was pretty much stifled. We didn't really have a connection to see how other people were doing. We had a sense that, hey, I think some people are going to do it tough, but you don't know to what extent. So when we first did it, I set aside 30 meals. I didn't really know how well it was going to be taken up. The queue was 60 deep already. And for a restaurant at that point in time, which was relatively new, relatively unknown, I just went to myself, shit, there's an issue out there. And I just quickly cobbled together 30 more extra meals and we just pushed them out. I had a moment of reflection after that and thought to myself, one meal is not going to cut it, you know. So I thought to myself, because lockdown was meant to be 6 weeks, let's just do this for 6 weeks. And then that's when cases got crazy. I remember cases got up to like 700 a day and stuff like that. So then the mindset sort of switched and went, maybe my business is going to fail. This lockdown doesn't look like it's going to end. But what am I going to do? Am I just going to sit at home with sit on my hands and do nothing? I'm not down for that. I just wanted to see, I just wanted to exhaust my resources really, and just went, hey, I'll just give it a go, whatever. Like
if you're going to
literally
go
poker,
down, you're
all
going to
in.
go down swinging.
That's right. Go down in a blaze of glory. In all honesty, that's my personality. If I'm going to go down, I'll go down in a blaze of glory. If I'm going to win a hand in poker, it's all in, you know.
Alan,
So
before you continue, can I ask, as a new Australian, to throw in that horribly offensive term from the 60s and 70s, were you surprised at the way all levels of government just left the international students to fend for themselves?
surprised is most really a euphemistic expression. I think I was just really disappointed. Yeah, I was extremely disappointed. For a country which has benefited immensely by being a recipient of, income generated from the international student community, it's hypocritical to act in such a way. It's short-sighted. It's extremely disappointing, and if anything, I think it's actually against Australian values. I don't blame Australia. I do blame decision makers, though. People who were empowered to try to supposedly represent us in this democracy, but I don't believe they actually really represented us. I think they took a very short-sighted view on, and they put dollars, short-term dollars first before, casting back and thinking what the bigger picture really is. So, thoroughly disappointed, thoroughly.
David, I've mentioned to you many times. I'm not sure if I've done it on the podcast before, but certainly in our private discussions, I think that decision to cast the international students essentially adrift with no support and with the government. I don't remember the exact words, but I think the words were, "You should leave."
Morrison
I think it was
just go home. He said,
yeah, just go home.
Heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking.
I have a feeling that in the next 10 years, that will be pushed back from our neighbours over and over again to our.
Absolutely.
I think it's going to take us five generations to outlive the shame that decision has put on us.
I hope it's less, because the cities, Alan will attest, Melbourne's dead without international students. International students bring a sense of vitality, a sense of energy to the city. They do the jobs that a lot of Australian people their age don't want to do. They have a hunger and love of this country that should make many of us born here realise how lucky we are. Alan, did you, no doubt in your workforce, you would have had international students working for you?
Well, not just international students. I had temporary resident visas, and that's the thing. They went from a student and they went down the path of a temporary resident visa because they were pretty much solidifying their aspirations to become Australian. They were left on the lurch as well.
It's awful.
Yeah.
And,
Alan,
the damage you mentioned, Grant, I mean, the borders are probably open to international students in the next 6 months or so, God willing, with exemptions, if not exemptions by virtue of vaccine. Whether they come back, I mean, there's a lot of chit-chat on social media from particular countries who certainly won't be coming back. We've got active evidence of people from the subcontinent telling their juniors not to come because of the way they were treated. So you're right, there will be substantial damage. It's a $6 billion industry in Victoria alone, and we'll hurt. The state of Victoria, the whole country will hurt. We're great champions, Alan, of international students because they make amazing Australians and amazing contributors to the country. To see your workforce with your workforce, did they leave? I mean, JobKeeper, what happened with JobKeeper in the restaurant?
There were only 3 people who were eligible for JobKeeper at my restaurant, and it was even more difficult to get JobKeeper status because of the timing in which we opened. We were only operational for 7 months.
That's right.
Yeah.
Prior to the pandemic.
New businesses were really discriminated against, which was a flaw in the system, because you had to be comparing your previous year's tax return to the prior year. So if you didn't have 2 trading years, you were essentially cut out of the loop. Alan,
Very much so, yeah.
tell us how you went from this situation where you were doing 700 meals in a session. How long could you keep it up, and how did you get any kind of assistance whatsoever from any of the local charities or from the city council? Or I mean, did anybody recognize what you were doing and muck in and help you? Because
We definitely did. I put out a call when things started to get quite dire. You know, when we knew that this wasn't going to be a 6-week lockdown, this was going to be an indefinite lockdown. So I put out a call, and once again, it shows the solidarity, it shows the compassion that as a community we have, not as a government, as a community we have for this plight. People around the community were donating goods. I had my suppliers, which donated goods as well. You know, we put together care packages. It was great because everyone understood. You know, it was almost unspoken that everyone understood. It's like, hey, let's all take a little bit, you know, carry this burden bit by bit. Because if we all chip in and if we all help out, it'll make that journey a lot easier for the masses. And at the end of the day, although, you know, credit's been pointed to me to start this, it was just myself as really a vessel for the greater community to act. You know, we were very fortunate. We spoke to some good friends who were regular customers of ours, and they were people of high places with contacts, and all they did was, you know, they picked up the phone, they called a couple of people, and the next day I had a whole lot of stock just put at my doorstep for distribution. And immensely grateful for those gestures. Immensely grateful. We acknowledged them on our social media. So yeah.
Do you want to give anyone in particular a sort of more public, more general sort of shout out? Because these are the stories that we didn't hear during the lockdown, and certainly from my point of view, I always think people who are sacrificing something real in an event like that, rather than doing things that you know, turns my stomach just for tax-driven reasons, and makes me angry. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to give credit to those people who have obviously, you know, if suppliers are donating. I mean, what does it cost to feed 700 people in a sitting, Alan?
Every week we would have burnt through approximately $3,000 to cover those the queues which would be coming through. And you know, in all honesty, I don't really want to credit one particular person or a handful of people, because I'll tell you the truth. The truth was, this was a massive community drive. Like anyone,
Right.
I think anyone who caught glimpse of it were compelled to help in some shape or form. And the beauty of it is, I really honestly believe that they helped in their capacity. And everyone's got different capacities, but the key thing is they helped in their capacity. You know, whether it was chipping in a couple of bucks or whether it was chipping in a lot more, I honestly, genuinely believe it was their capacity at that point in time, and they all should get a pat in the back. They really should all get a pat in the back.
You made a big difference, and the suppliers made a big difference to the lives of dynamic young people who will one day be wonderful Australians. Tell me some of their stories. How did they express their relief, their gratitude that there was somebody local, yourself, feeding them high quality, nutritious meals? What are some of the stories, the feedback you got from those you fed?
Oh gosh, those people who came through. There were migrants. There was some young families as well. So people who were living in Australia on dependent visas. Uh, you know, it's interesting. It wasn't just students. Initially, yes, students were identified as a key demographic which would be suffering the brunt of it. But if you recall, when the JobKeeper amount ratcheted down, suddenly people who were just scraping by now entered into the poverty zone. They really couldn't make their rent. They couldn't make their car repayments, or they couldn't make their mortgage repayments. They couldn't easily feed their dependents. There was, the demographic it reached out definitely got bigger. But, we spoke to a lot of students, and one thing that I think the Australian government forgot, the key decision makers forgot, were this is a global pandemic. The excuse that they used was, when you filled out that form, there was a little box that you'd tick and saying that, if the proverbial shit hit the fan, that
You
you
got the
have family
funds.
support. Yeah, you've got funds. But you know what? This is a global pandemic. This is absolutely, you know, extraordinary circumstances. Don't close your eyes and be ignorant of it, and just look at a little technicality there on your form, and use that to absolve your sense of responsibility towards another human being. So I think, it was disappointing, but the community overshadowed the government's short sight. The community genuinely helped. The community was
How
there
long did the program run for?
17 weeks.
Wow, it's extraordinary.
That is, and
It's extraordinary.
Alan, I've only got one more question that touches on the sort of political, but we're consistently told that Melbourne is winning awards or surveys or whatever for the one of the most livable cities in the world and whatnot. And we trumpet that in our identity, and our local government, state government push that image relentlessly in all of their PR material. Did did you did you have any? Did anyone from the council reach out and become involved officially or unofficially to support you through?
Unfortunately, not. They didn't. To be honest,
And
they didn't.
apart from Job Seeker, which as a new business you couldn't really avail yourself fully of it anyway, was there any sort of special purpose grants or anything like that that you were able to access?
The city of Melbourne did provide a suite of grants to try to ease that burden as much as possible. And we were fortunate to be recipients of those grants. I mean, I have to be grateful for those grants, because I wouldn't be operating today without those grants. The question of the quantum is another thing altogether, but the gesture was definitely there. There were other, initiatives that the government did introduce, like cash boost and that, which were all designed to help, and they did. And like I said, I wouldn't be still operating today if it wasn't for those mechanisms. But it's really the chicken and the egg as well. If we only need to look at Western Australia, for example, Perth, where they didn't experience such a harsh lockdown. Or if we go look at Sydney, for example, which deployed a more targeted type lockdown approach. Yes, those places, well, Sydney still suffers a little bit. Perth is absolutely fine from what I saw.
Yeah.
My, yeah.
My personal opinion on that, Alan, since you've made it a comparatively national thing, is that I don't think anybody who was not in Melbourne at the time that we had the lockdown can understand what it was actually like. I don't think that any of the legislators and decision makers who were based in other parts of the country when they were sitting around the cabinet table, and the public servants all giving advice and whatnot, I don't think anybody had the capacity to understand what it was like. But I think the people in France and Italy and certainly in like places like the Philippines now and the UK, those people will have long and enduring memories of an experience similar to the ones that we went through. Alan, Cash Boost was a state government. Was that one of the state government programs?
I believe that was a federal government program because it was but a sort of recalculation and recalibration on our GST.
That was a GST return forgiveness or temporary non-collection, I think, wasn't it, for a while?
Correct, yes.
Sorry, David, just one last thing. What's the situation with the restaurant now? Are you still needing, or are you still finding that people are needing some assistance from those people that you were serving during the 17-week period?
Not so much. When Melbourne reopened, there was a massive drop. We went from queues which basically reached our storefront, which is near the corner of Flinders and Queen Street, all the way snaking around Elizabeth Street, right? So that's basically an entire block. I remember the last day in which we did it, and when I decided to wrap things up, we had 12 people. So one thing I was grateful for was knowing that it wasn't just a bunch of people who were, scabs. These were people who were in genuine need. It was also validation that it was the lockdown which was driving this, because when everything opened up, everyone could get back to work, everyone could contribute and move freely again.
They talk about pandemics being a thing we've got to get used to in the future. What you did was a thing of beauty, and in 14 years of immigration, I think it's one of the most heartwarming stories. Would you do it again?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, yeah.
How's the restaurant tracking now, Alan? And have you introduced any pandemic specials to your regular menu?
Well, we definitely had to streamline things a lot more. We had to think, we had to be COVID ready, and we are. We've got all our COVID safe protocols and as such. If you recall, we went through that brief 5-day lockdown, which hit us during Lunar New Year and Valentine's Day celebrations, which was a real blow to the hospitality industry. But we were ready. We didn't skip a beat. We dished out a lot of takeaway during that time, and I think it's just one of those things that we've got to be prepared for what sort of comes about from this pandemic, and it will change the way we think and approach things for generations. But I think the best thing is to be COVID safe, not COVID scared.
You talked about the beautiful Singapore crab jaffle. Can you just give Grant and I and listeners a rundown? That I haven't stopped thinking about that. What are some of the other Australian or Singapore Australian creations on the menu? Because I'm going to take Grant and we're going to get stuck into some crab chili, Singapore crab jaffles.
Good stuff. Well, we've also got a Wagyu Vegemite beef rendang.
Oh my God!
So there's some great stuff in Australia that we can I've incorporated into our cuisine here, and it's just good stuff.
What about beverages? Any sort of hybrid drinks on offer?
Oh, hybrid drinks. Yeah, we've got a pretty good range of cocktails. So we've got a play on an aviation where we use butterfly PT instead, which is a common ingredient in Southeast Asia. We've got our little play on a Singapore sling, but we've used a gin-based version here. A vodka-based version instead, local vodka. Come on down and
God, yeah.
have
My shout,
yourself
Grant,
a
on
feast.
record. My shout.
Well, I'm taking you up on that one, and maybe we'll do a follow up with you from in store. I'll bring the portable recorder down, Alan, and we'll David and I can do an episode sitting at one of your tables enjoying. I like the idea of Vegemite in rendang. That's just
fantastic.
Well, it's frightening and salivating at the same time. David, I know I sort of promoted this and mentioned to you that I thought Alan was a hero. I'm recalibrating my language because I've having spoken to him. Alan's a genuine community leader, and one of the reasons we love doing the show is because that's who we continually meet. Our migrant community pushes forward our leaders. In fact, this pandemic has shown us that the people who wear the tag leader in an official sense, in so many cases, and this is one of them that is glaring, we're not up to that tag, and that people from within the greater community always pick up the slack, and they're not always people who speak like me and you, David.
Alan, deeply moving and thrilled that you came on the program. I can't tell you how much Grant and I thank you for your time. Do you have what time service? We just looked at the clock. Service would be what time service?
About an hour's time.
Well, we better leave you in peace. We better leave you to get ready. Thank you for taking the time. It's been a thrill and an honour, and you are a great Australian.
Absolute honour.
You extol virtues that all of us aspire to. You live them.
Now, Alan, before you jump off, here's where you get to spruik your wares. Where should people, if they're visiting Melbourne, how is the easiest way to come down and sample your fare?
Come on down to 350 Flinders Lane, Tian 38. We're not far from Flinders Station. We're in heart of CBD. If you're staying near Crown, we're just across the river. Come down for a Singaporean-inspired feast. We can't travel to Singapore just yet, but you can come down to my restaurant.
I've just pinned exactly. You're about 100 metres from the 7-Eleven.
That's right.
I know exactly where you are. So I'll be able to lead Grant with no loss of direction. And
amazing.
Also, too, you're not far up from 333 Collins Street, the spectacular marble building. I know exactly.
A beautiful place where we've got some wonderful regular customers as well.
We better let you go get ready. Thanks for the time.
Awesome
You've been a champion, Alan. Thank you, mate.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, David. Thank you, Grant.
It's our pleasure indeed, Alan. Alan Chong, thanks for being with us. David, is there any migration information we need to know this week?
Nothing of great import, nothing earth-shattering. I mean, it's the most dynamic area of law in the country, as we know. And the story with migration is it changes one day changes. There's constant change. But in terms, this week is a week for state nomination for Victoria. And so up until from the 6th to the 12th, those in the medical profession, doctors, nurses, people who can help rebuild. Victoria's taking registration of interest for nomination. So doctors who've satisfied the criteria, nurses who satisfy the criteria, engineers, social workers, they can put in application for nomination by the state for 190 visas. They've got to have their expressions of interest already ready post-September of last year. And the story is that they're in for a chance to be invited in Victoria. Queensland is not introducing this month its 190 program. They're going to rely on the numbers they already have, so that will not open. If you look at the Queensland website, it says they're going to open now, April, but they're not going to. So, yeah, I mean, just Queensland and Victorian specific news. Immigration goes on in new ways, different ways. People are still coming in on working visas if they're doctors, if they're specialists, but it's not the wonderful open slather that we've had where international students come, study, graduate, go 485, go expression of interest 189. Those days are quite some time off. Let's hope, though, that international students do get an exemption or they're allowed to travel and come in, because we miss them dearly on this show. And, you know, Alan has lived, well, what he's done is extraordinary, and he's fed the people who are the great Australians of the future, looked after them the way no one else has. No one else has.
Well, I fear that I embarrassed him with some of the terminology I used, but we did get a comment while the interview was going on, David, from Facebook. Jesse Dan, just pretty simple. He has a great heart.
There it is. Pure, great words from Jesse. Great words. He has a good heart, a very good heart indeed.
So, David, what we need to tell the listeners who were interested in what you were talking about, the 190 visas, we've got a couple of episodes that we have already put out there.
Already put in the can? Absolutely.
In our archive for the 190 visa. So look them up in our stream or on our YouTube page, on our Facebook page.
Victoria's doing another round in May. It's the penultimate round for the migration year, this one. They're not doing one in June because the new migration year ends June. This migration year ends June 30.
And then everyone gears up then for September, don't they, David?
Well, July 1's a new migration year, so we'll see if there's anything new in the upping in the first week or two of July. And then people who are studying come to finish their courses October, November, more migration in December. Let's hope the rollout picks things up and gets people back here. Or, I mean, you know, what I said earlier to Alan, the city's dead without international students. Yeah, all the cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, there's no life. They bring a life of vitality, a street culture that we miss dearly.
It is slowly improving. I went into the city a couple of times during the week, and it certainly, week by week, it's clawing itself back. But yeah, it's a long way from where we want to be. Now, David, coming up, we're trying to track down some more people with amazing stories to tell. Now, I don't know if I'm going to be successful, but I am trying to find the most popular personality in the Philippines who was born near the Yarra River in a small country town in northern Victoria, but who nobody knows anything about here unless they're from a particular ethnic background. And she has a sister who is almost as famous, who nobody knows anything about.
She was born here as well.
Absolutely. And
fantastic.
And we're so we're going to try and broaden our stories out a little bit more. But yeah, it's
a little joy from the Philippines, Grant. I mean, that's something wonderful, because the Philippines have been having a rough time with COVID, cyclones, you name it. The Philippines have had it. It's
the lockdown that they're experiencing in some parts of the main island now is it's heartbreaking, because they've been through a period of rolling lockdowns. And look, I say it all the time on our show, David, that we sit here in a very, very, very privileged part of the world, and everyone's going batshit crazy about vaccine problems here. Well, some parts of the world are 3 years away from getting vaccines in their arms. So, let's always keep a bit of perspective on the pandemic. It's ongoing. We need to all live with it, but we need to live with it better together, I think. So, yeah.
Nicely put.
Fingers crossed, David. Well, Mr. Bongiorno, David Bongiorno, at David Bongiorno. How do we spell that, David?
So the Twitter handle, the quickest, fastest way to get in touch is at David, D-A-V-I-D, Bongiorno, B-O-N-G-I-O-R-N-O, all one word, David Bongiorno at Twitter. Direct message me. We'll tee up a time for a phone discussion, tee up a time to go Skype, Zoom, whatever suits, whatever's easy, and go through what can and cannot be done. Because remember, in immigration, it's as important to know what you can do as well as what you can't do. We don't want anyone going off on a frolic of their own. They need to be guided so that they navigate the maze of migration with ease and less minimum stress.
Now, David, I don't like to do things like this terribly often, but I'm on a bit of a crusade at the moment. So I would like any listeners who are based in Australia who have an old computer sitting in a cupboard in their office or in their spare room or under the stairs, laptop or desktop, it doesn't matter. I'm trying to repurpose some to help out some people in the countries where we've been focusing our attention. So reuse, recycle, that kind of phraseology, that ethic. If you happen to have one and you'd like to help me out, we can work out how it gets from you to me. But just look me up on my socials, Twitter at WorkTheCloudOz, OZ. Check out the Migrating to Australia page or our Twitter feed, David's or mine, and you'll find a way to get hold of me. I'd really appreciate it if you've got a piece of junk, what you consider junk, lying around. I know some people who could seriously use them, and we will be making some people very productive and change their lives. So there we go. There, I've got my begging bowl out. I thought the episode with Alan would be an appropriate place to introduce that, David, because he's obviously a man who's focused on making a difference for other people, and I salute him. I'm glad he came on.
Me too. Great call to invite him, and we thank him again for his wonderful input into Melbourne society.
So, dear listener, I hope you've enjoyed it, hung on all the way through, and we look forward to bringing the next Migrating to Australia podcast episode with you or to you. And don't forget, if you can't listen to us for any reason on your podcast, we're on Facebook and YouTube, where you can check out how devastatingly handsome both David and I am.
Good heads for radio. Grant, have a good week.
Ciao, everybody.
Ciao, ciao.